greet you all this evening on behalf of Kesher Israel. No, I am not the president of the shul. I miss Al Shul very much. I think he's probably with his grandchildren, I would suspect. I was the former president of the shul. My name is Rosenblatt, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. By way of introduction, as all of you know, and as our revered Rabbi indicated from the pulpit yesterday, we are blessed to be between two twin sidrot, rarely read separately. Vayakhel we have covered, and Perpetuated is the coming attraction of this weekend. And it begins with Elie Pekudei HaMishkan. These are the Pekudei, these are the accounts of the Mishkan. Orthodoxy translates it Elie Minyanei HaMishkan. These are the sums, the accounts, the numbers of the accoutrements of the gold, the silver, and all that were part of the Mishkan. And Judaism, Lashon HaKodesh in particular, has this wonderful way, etymologically, of investing the most mundane words, in this case the word pekudei, accounts, with greater meaning and greater context. And the word that should come to mind is the word from Vayera, Vadoshem, Pakad et Sarna. And God remembered Sarah. And how did he remember Sarah? He remembered her with giving her Isaac, giving her and Abraham Isaac, and giving us the continuity of the Jewish people for 4,000 years. And it is in this sense that Kesher Israel is also counting, if you will, and celebrating the continuity of its centennial, not in the form of the Mishkan necessarily with bricks and mortar, but with limud Torah, with dipping into the wellspring of our teaching. And that, if one were to describe in a single sentence what Kesher Israel is all about, it is that intellectual vigor which is represented by the invitation to these wonderful participants in our symposium of this evening. This is indeed our third symposium to celebrate our centennial. It is a turning point, a national conversation of what Orthodoxy means. And tonight we talk about new generations and old institutions. And I would like to introduce the moderator, who in turn will introduce the august participants in this evening's symposium. The moderator is Gary Rosenblatt, who is the editor and publisher of the Jewish Week of New York, the largest and perhaps the best-known Jewish weekly in the country. Gary's reputation insofar as Jewish writing and being an editor of a Jewish newspaper goes far and wide. He was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He is the founder and the chairman of what is referred to as the Conversation, an annual retreat for American Jewish leaders. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Gary, who will introduce the participants. Wonderful to see.
Thank you very much. Can I be heard on my sound system? No. Any advice from...
It's not like show, they don't have a microphone.
Maybe I should turn it on. How about now? Okay. So much for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. I sit here as a journalist with my notebook and pen in hand this evening. That's in case I say anything interesting tonight, I can stop and write it down. There's a story told, I'll make it a brief story, but there's a story told that I think many of us can identify with about a businessman who had a very, very important meeting in New York City one day, and he made the mistake of driving to the meeting, and he couldn't find a place to park. And he kept looking at his watch, and he saw he was late, and he's circling the block, and he can't find anything. He can't find a garage. And finally, he does something he's never done before. He starts praying out loud in his car. He says, God, I never asked you anything like this before, but you got to help me find a parking spot. I promise, if you help me out, I'm gonna bench after every meal. I'm gonna go to shul 2 times. Never mind, I found one. That's a true story. And I guess the point is that there are small miracles that take place in our lives all around us, probably every day, and we sometimes don't recognize that fact. And one of them, which brings us to the topic hopefully this evening, is the Jewish institutions, the voluntary Jewish institutions that we've built in this country that we often take for granted, that we are a voluntary community besides our synagogues, the Jewish organizational structure, and all the acronyms that we sometimes make fun of, but they are the envy of the rest of our society, often in the kind of philanthropic work we do, the social service work we do. So one of the issues that we're going to talk about is how those will fare in the 21st century. And I just want to say it's an honor for me to be here in this historic shul. We have some connections. Our son Avi, when he was a graduate student at Georgetown, was a member here, and your Rebbitzin, it's okay to say, Sharon was a babysitter for our kids. Judy and I always remember fondly that, and any problems we have with our kids, we blame on you. And my brother and I grew up in Annapolis, Maryland, in the shul of Knesset Israel that celebrated its centennial just a few years ago. So we recognize the accomplishment that is, and it's something that obviously you're very proud of, and we wish you mazel tov. It's also very impressive to see this turnout on Oscar night. In case any of you didn't know that's taking place. I don't know if that means that no one here goes to the movies, or more likely that we all have TiVo. So the evening's program is, as you know, is part of the centennial celebration, and the topic is New Generations, Old Institutions. And we have a really remarkable panel to discuss this, where we are headed at a time when affiliation with synagogues and Jewish institutions appears to be on the decline, and when more and more young people seem to be turned off by denominational labels like Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and the phrase just Jewish is becoming more popular. But we might not be sure just what that means. What happens when affiliation weakens and when personal satisfaction seems to trump communal commitment? So before I introduce our panelists, let me just tell you a little bit about the format for tonight. In the interest of making this program as informal and interactive as possible, and to have more time for questions from the audience, we're going to dispense with opening statements or remarks from the panelists, and instead have a real conversation, hopefully. So I want to encourage our panelists to respond to each other's points, and in general, try and keep your remarks brief, to speak not more than a minute or two in your responses, and we will take questions from the audience as well a little bit later on. So, do you have a problem yet? founders and observers and leaders in the Jewish community with us tonight. It's one thing to be an observer, but each of our panelists is deeply engaged in Jewish life. And so let me start, I guess, I'll work my way to the left here. To my immediate left is Rabbi Elie Kaunfer, who is co-founder and executive director of Machon Hadar in New York, which recently launched the first full-time egalitarian yeshiva program in North America. Elie was selected as an inaugural Avichai Fellow and is the author of What Independent Minyanim Can Teach Us About Vibrant Jewish Communities. Welcome to Elie. Next to Elie is Dr. Stephen Cohen, a sociologist of American Jewry, a research professor of Jewish social policy at HUC-JIR, the first of probably many acronyms to mention this evening, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, and director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archives at NYU. He's done numerous surveys on Jewish life, and his current research focuses on the emerging patterns of Jewish identity and community among Jews in their 20s and 30s. Welcome, Steve. Next to Steve is Dr. Erica Brown, scholar in residence for the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, the Jewish Agency, and other Jewish nonprofits. The author of several books on topics like spiritual boredom, inspired Jewish leadership, and confronting scandal in the Jewish community. The New York Times columnist David Brooks devoted a whole column to the last and that for her, Judaism isn't a punchline or a source of neuroticism, it's a path to self-confidence and superior living. Welcome,
I did not say superior.
And our fourth speaker is Dr. Jonathan Sarna, professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, and recognized as a leading commentator on American Jewish history. In 2009, he was elected to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So, welcome, a formal welcome for our panelists. So I thought we'd start, maybe I'd pose a question we could each have just a brief response to, and then we'll get into some more specifics for each of you. It seems like the Jewish community built institutions to meet people's needs, particularly in the last century or century ago. And today it seems like many of the institutions are still there, but not necessarily the need. So I wonder if you could just give us a brief comment, and maybe we'll start, Jonathan, and work our way this way.
First of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here. I was here for the first time when I wrote my doctorate, and then I said some Kaddish here with Joe Lieberman, who was also saying Kaddish at the same time, and it's always nice to be back. And I want to praise, and then we'll get to the answer, but it great courage to celebrate the centennial when Yeshiva University celebrated its centennial. Reputed there was a big dinner, and an ad came from Sakmar to Yeshiva University, bis 120. So it takes some doing to till 120. It takes some courage to celebrate a centennial in the Jewish world. That said, in terms of institutions, every time we have seen young people who have become excited in Jewish life, they have naturally felt that existing institutions don't meet their needs, and they have founded new institutions. That was true in 1825, when there were breakaways from the synagogue, the single synagogues in New York and Charleston by young people, and in New York they founded B'nai Jeshurun, and in Charleston the Reformed Society of Israelites, a new institution, It was true in the late 19th century when again young people are active, beginning in the 1870s, producing most of the institutions that we know today. It was true when young Israel was founded. They actually were young ones. And they founded an institution because they felt that the other Orthodox institutions weren't meeting the needs of young people. And hence the name Young Israel. It's a very dangerous name. It's like New College in Oxford or something. It's a very dangerous, but and today too, I think we see young people who look at institutions, say they don't meet our needs. We need new institutions. The problem, as you point out, is it's much easier in America to create new institutions than to put the old institutions to rest. And therefore we have lots and lots of institutions, many of them won't be named, that don't anymore serve the function that they once served. Every once in a while there's an economic downturn and a few disappear, but we tend to grow new institutions. I think we're seeing that now, seeing a range of new institutions, Hadar being one, the new minyanim, some 70 of them, and that is the typical manifestation. Young people feeling our needs aren't met. It's a free country. We're going to create new institutions more in tune with what we think Judaism should be.
Okay. Erica, is that a good thing?
First of all, I'm the only one who qualifies for the Best Actress Award. I just wanted to say that.
I was just going to say, so I'll say it now, that there was one surprise I've heard so far from the Oscars, which started in about 3 minutes, so I'll use it anyway, that Lindsay Lohan actually stole the Best Actress Award. Literally.
But you really prepared a lot of it. That's perfect. I actually think that it's probably unfair to say that there aren't needs. The question is changing needs. I think that the American Jewish community has done a remarkable job in the past 100 or so years, since we're celebrating the centennial, of building institutions and taking care of, they used to say from cradle to grave, but now we do the more gentle from baby to booby. But just, creating that cushion and that safety net. And I think we can't belittle the significance of creating that safety net across the lifespan for people. And we've done a remarkable job of it. The problem is that what I'm seeing among young professionals and the millennial population generally is that of all the abbreviations that our Jewish organizations go by, the letter that people care about most is the J in Jewish today. And we've done the least work in talking about what the Jewish values of Jewish institutional life is. And so when I see a group of young Jewish leaders, I know that the question that is most on their minds often is the spiritual, voluntaristic notion of why be Jewish. And we really haven't answered that question for people. And I think that in that sense, we've betrayed a little bit of our institutional identity by not answering that question with greater depth. Where that will take us, I don't know. I'm not afraid, as John says in American Jewry, that the American Judaism, the idea of recreating institutions and the continuity of discontinuity is a very powerful notion. And I'm not afraid of it. I think the Orthodox community has somewhat ignored the sociological literature. And I do this so that my friend Stephen, stays in business. But I think the Orthodox community is great with the Rashi, and okay with the Tosfot. I think when it comes to sociology, we're still hiding ourselves in the sand, and we need to do a better job of reading the research that's very clearly out there about what does it mean to reinvent institutions, and thinking that it's not going to go away, or that Orthodox young people don't feel that is not true. And I think one of the reasons that we've got the strong egal minyan and independent minyan movement is because Orthodox institutions weren't really trying to be ahead of the curve on this.
I'm trying to think how to answer your question. The question, I think, expresses some alarm and surprise about the decreased meaningfulness of Jewish institutions for Jews.
Well, just to amplify, in other words, just about 100 years ago, there was this creation of groups like the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress. A lot of the needs that they were meeting were new immigrants. Right. They were anti-Semitism, and perhaps, certainly in part because of their work and other factors, a lot of these critical issues have been resolved to a great degree. Do we still need these institutions? In other words, institutions were created to meet people's needs. Now it seems like the opposite. Like the institutions are there, and the people who run them say, well, we have to convince other people why they have to join us, even though the needs might be changing.
I'll think about in the last 10 years, there's been a efflorescence of new Jewish institution building in 5 areas. In independent minyanim being one, the whole area of spirituality, self-initiated Jewish learning, Limud being a classic example, but all of us and everybody going on the internet to find things and to read, to do their own reading, but basically Jews taking care of their own learning growth. Third, social justice plus, there's a huge explosion of it, and it was not just because of AJWS, Youth Messenger, and there were numerous other organizations that sprung up, and that was one that we were most aware of, but there were many of them. Jewish culture, the growth of Jews doing all kinds of things from videos to films to music and so forth. And the fifth area being new media. It spans all this stuff, but also as a new locus of Jewish activity. So you have all these things happening, and if I have more than my 2 minutes, in each area I would tell you that there are American or world parallels in each area. The cost of, for example, the cost of production of culture declined considerably. So as CBS, the New York Times, and Sunday Records found out, for example. There's all kinds of home churching going on. So there are parallels in the large society. So this is going on on the one hand. But as Rob Putnam said in Bowling Alone, soccer did not replace Little League. In other words, like there were more kids, theoretically. The numbers of Little League declined more than the number of soccer players grew. So I think it's fair to say that the number of ADL plus has declined more than everything else, the Elie Kaunfers and all his friends grew. So, you guys. So, it's very nice to see the NCSY Alumni Association here today. I appreciate you. So the question is, why is this happening? And big goal, there are general reasons and there are Jewish reasons. General reasons that we go into, but the Jewish reasons cannot be gainsaid. And the truth of the matter is that, and I'll point right to it, when 50% of the Jewish population marries non-Jews, when about 2/3 of the young population, when they're in a romantic relationship, married or partnered, are partnered with non-Jews, the presence of non-Jews inhibits the involvement of Jews in Jewish life and acts as an independent factor to make it less meaningful to be Jewishly engaged. So it turns out, by the way, that the number of Jews within the in-married population, the proportion that's actively involved in Jewish life, actually is higher today than it was, 20 years ago. It's a more powerful, except that community, that reservoir of in-married Jews, has declined. That's one more thing to say. I was just reading a book on the train today, coming down Marion, came down from New York to Washington, of course. A large and increasing number of American Jews would probably like to participate in Jewish affairs on a more meaningful level than that of fundraising, but the present structure of the community affords them few opportunities. Jonathan?
But you like it?
Good for you.
They practice it.
1949, and I can go. I have more praise to turn down. So, what Jonathan was saying before, that the sense that Jewish life is institutionally meaningless has been with us for a long time. Probably since Moshe Rabbeinu left for us.
Impact of technological change is again one of these currents that repeats itself when the cost of printing declined. It became easy, so suddenly Jewish leaders, Isaac Mayer Weiss, say the printing press can save Judaism. And we see a tremendous outpouring of printing when the telephone and the subway make possible new forms of communication and social networking, which of course they didn't know but might have. That's transformative in the late 19th century, and young people use this technology. And of course, technology is extraordinarily important today. And we should remember that when we think that it's only Jewish issues. It's partly Jewish issues. It's partly the availability of new technology that transforms Judaism and that hopefully we learn how to use to strengthen Judaism. Printing did that a long time ago, and we've repeated it ever since.
Elie, you still got another question?
I'll see. 2 minutes. Briefly on institutions, I would say that for me, an institution is a means to an end. I'm institution neutral in terms of my feeling towards them. To the extent that they're accomplishing their end, I'm pro. And to the extent that they're not, I'm not. I think that what Dr. Brown said about the focus of this.
Call me Erica.
What Erica said about the focus of Jewish institutions in terms of Jewish education and sort of amplifying the J in all the acronyms isn't happening, and therefore I think that there's some room for institutional development. That's why I'm doing my business. But I think that fundamentally, like my wife and I, our largest charitable gift is to UJA Federation, and we're proud of that because we think they do a good job of what their mission is. And I founded a minyan, and I belong to a shul, and I see it all as expressing the values that I'm trying to put out in the world.
So let me come back to you. Some people see the flourishing of these startup Jewish groups and independent minyanim as a direct critique of the establishment. And some veterans say the trend indicates a certain selfishness among younger people looking for their own forms of expression. How do you respond to that? I'm sure you've heard this before.
Well, I think that when you have that frame of analysis, you have to ask yourself, is what the independent minyanim are doing, are they attempting to replace other institutions that are in theory threatened by them, or are they filling a vacuum that is not being met by any existing institution? And I think that, for me, the analog I look to is Hillel. Nobody challenges Hillel on campus and says, you 18 to 22-year-olds, you should all join your synagogue that's down the street. Why aren't you? How could you dare be all on your own? And I think that the reason that we don't challenge Hillel, partly because it's very old, but partly because there's a recognition that college is a particular developmental stage that warrants people forming community on their own, and in fact is a leadership training ground that was almost accidental since it was really meant to be a kosher kitchen, but fundamentally turned into a place where people learn how to run their communities by the age of 21. They're not perfect communities, but they sort of gain those skills. And so, for me, I think that sort of the narrow view of independent minyanim is, if you take, to quote David Brooks again, the Odyssey generation, the people who are not yet reached all of life's milestones that would, be called settled down. That extends well beyond college, and maybe independent minyanim are the institutional arena where that plays out. That actually is growing the pie and not stealing. I would just add in terms of the odd to describe a movement that's basically about forming community and selfish in a world where all of the general cultural trends are towards looking at your iPhone and not talking to anybody else, or even crazier, praying to God. So I don't see a selfish angle there, unless you view it as one person, as a zero-sum game, essentially. And for that, I also look at Orthodoxy. I mean, we're celebrating 100 years of an Orthodox synagogue. Is Orthodoxy selfish for separating out from the general community? After all, they're the most educated, most highly engaged group of people that you have. Why not just join the general crowd? After all, the 90% of Jews are missing the 10% of the cream of the crop. Well, I think any reasonable Orthodox person would say, well, that's because our expression of Judaism is just simply different from the other 90%. And I think to some extent that's what the independent minyanim are. To the extent that you want to try to box them in, you can find something that is, well, they're closest to X or Y, but fundamentally I think there's something different. And it gets back to what said about the fundamentally the internet is about segmentation, and that you can view that as selfish. I'm sure NBC would wish that everybody was watching NBC, CBS, or ABC, but at the end of the day, it's about a whole variety of options out there, and I think that's what we're seeing in the Jewish world also.
If I can respond with an analogy, because I could turn the table and say perhaps the establishment is being selfish. And I always think about it as you create a party, you decide as a community you want to create a party, and you say to the young people in your community, we have such a great party for you. We want you to come to our party. And this is what it costs, and this is when it is, and this is where it is. And they turn around and say, we had nothing to do with the planning of this party. We're not coming to your party. And I think that that's what's going on a lot in the federated world as I see it, is people in the baby boomer generation who are saying, this is the party we created for you, and you're not grateful, and you're not paying dues, and you're not paying membership, and you're not fundraising for us. And other people are saying, we want meaning, you're not delivering, and you haven't used our voice in leveraging this. So you could turn the table around on the selfish thing. You do see it the other way, because you have a lot of millennials who are saying, we want to make our own party, and actually, you're not invited, and will you pay for it? So that's, and I think actually the establishment has responded in some measure by saying, sure, we'll pay for it, and actually I have an issue, because the people I teach who are over 26, which is the bulk of my adult education population, are basically saying to me, would you give me a free trip to Israel? And they're right in asking, why can't I have a free trip to Israel? In other words, I'm really much more invested in long-term Jewish life. So I think what I'm actually seeing is Generation X is actually suffering the most in this, because they don't have the power brokering of the baby boomer generation, who are often leading these organizations, and they're not as interesting. Everybody now wants the young people. Let's make the young people happy. So there are people who are emerging leaders in Generation X who really don't have the platform and aren't getting the mentoring to lead. So I actually think the selfish thing works two ways.
I want to add that Eric already mentioned the idea that continuity depends upon discontinuity is actually one of the great lessons of Jewish history. We talk all the time about continuity, but Hasidism was a great discontinuity. Or in the 20th century, like Doug said, Jewish day schools, a terrible discontinuity. Sabbatianism, the false messianism of Shabtai Tzvi. There's also a discontinuity and a great disaster. But it is nevertheless important to recognize that the right kinds of discontinuities rejuvenate Judaism, and young people have traditionally been the engine of that kind of rejuvenation.
I either want to take issue with something Elie said, or to convince him that he doesn't mean it. It's one or the other. But and that was about your neutrality towards institutions. I'm not neutral towards Jewish institutions. By the way, I think you're not either. But we'll find out in a second. So to take the best case, so from my side, the institution known as Medinat Yisrael. It's very important to me that we be safe, be secure, be act in a way which is consistent with Jewish values that I know and believe in. But I would extend that to all other American or all other Jewish institutions. Jewish institutions are part and parcel of what it means to be Jewish. If you're a poet, you want good poetry. If you're a Protestant, you want good faith. But if you're Jewish, you want good we just came out.
You want a good sandwich.
This week's parsha just left. It's Vayakel, and that sometimes is translated, and thou shalt communize. You shall be a kehillah. So the kehillah is the essence. So the product of being Jewish, one of the critical products of being Jewish is good Jewish institutions. So turning to you, your answer to the presence of bad Jewish institutions that didn't work for you was to create other Jewish institutions. You didn't say I don't like Jewish institutions. I'm going to do something. I'm going to go up to a mountaintop and look over the Pacific or everything. But you're going to create another institution, and you're replacing it. You're regenerating. So I think you're actually saying, not that you don't think institutions are important, you just think these institutions aren't working. So you're going to do the Jewish thing, and you'll create other institutions because you believe in good Jewish institutional life.
Right. So I guess let me clarify. I wasn't objecting to the existential existence of institutions. I guess I'm pro-existential institutions as an organizing phenomenon, and I want to bracket the institution of the State of Israel, which obviously I have strong feelings for, not as the institution that things on the table here tonight. I think for what I meant to say was any given institution has a mission, and whether that institution is achieving the mission, I'm in favor of it. But I'm more in favor of the mission than the particular bricks and mortar or board or 21st century instantiation of it. And I started a few institutions. People always assume but Hadar's going to turn institutional and then won't be as good. So who says? It's much better to have some stability in some ways that I guess is, we never define what an institution is, but, we all know what we're talking about, sorry. But,
we know it when we see it.
And I'm pro the good parts of it.
I actually want to add something that I heard someone say at a professional conference. They said, in Jewish life, unlike corporate life, has no mergers and acquisitions, right? Everybody who's anyone needs to have their own Jewish institution, their own board, and I actually think that the economic downturn in many ways is helping us filter that a little bit and say, not every institution has to exist because our missions are sometimes so narrowly defined and the contours of who's allowed to be in them and what they support isn't so radically different from standing on the outside looking in. And I think we sometimes think that everyone has just a slight nuance of a difference. This means we need a new institution. And I think that becomes more problematic than institutions.
We're a lot better at saying, that those people over there need to get together.
Yeah.
About ourselves. But Jonathan, I have a question for you. You talked earlier about how previous generations have had the same patterns, the generational clashes. I wonder how this one is different, if you see it, and maybe particularly in comparison to the Chavurah movement of the early 70s and sort of what we take away from that experience.
So, actually, Elie direction as well. It's the remarkable part of our world is how flat it's gotten. The Jewish women's movement influenced Israel, but I think much of the spiritual development today has come from Israel, the United States. So I could say, naturally, much more, but I would think those developments do distinguish it. And I want to emphasize, I think it's wonderful that every 30 years or so we have a kind of youth rebellion. Ashreinu Makov Chelkeinu. If we stop having those youth rebellions, then obviously what will happen is people will just check out. This is given great excitement, great vibrance, and what we know will happen, because it's always happened before, is people will eventually move from the outside in. Many innovations of the minyan movement will be seen in your synagogues, in the plural. At the 200th anniversary, we will look back and say what influence there was, just as every synagogue has been influenced by some of the ideas of the Chavurah movement and going before that. Just as John Ruskin moved from the outside in and transformed UJA, so you're proud to give the largest part of your tzedakah to it. So I think over and over again, we've seen movements from the outside in Jewish life, and that is a good thing. Outsiders bring all sorts of new ideas, new energy, new knowledge. I teach at a university named for an outsider who came in and transformed Jewish life. Louis Brandt, I have to mention him once in every talk to my but that's a classic example. And we need more of such. It doesn't mean there isn't room for the insiders, but we've benefited enormously from outsiders historically.
Right.
Steve.
No. I feel like Joe Biden at that 1988 debate, JFK was a friend of mine.
Is that Louis Brandeis?
No, about my good friend Jonathan's description of the Chavurah movement. I'm trying to think, there were a bunch of precious Amaratza who got together. And then today we got this great rebellion where we're all getting together. Wait a second. Art Green, Bola Hyman, John Ruskin, Alan Mintz, Barry Holt, the list goes on. Leon, do you have down there? Yeah. That was another place, right? No, but I and the Chavurah that I knew about grew out of Camp Ramah, and I have a very different image of the Chavurah than you do. I only lived through it. You probably studied it, but so you may have evidence that I'm not aware of. And the description of Israel. I mean, yes, these guys. Elie was the one who forced me to put the question: "Have you spent 4 months or more in Israel?" on the minyan survey that we did together, and I thought it was ridiculous, and he was right. It was a huge number, it's like 52%, whatever. So this large number of minyan members had spent 4 months more in Israel. So you're right in that school. But in those days, we were extraordinarily involved with Israel. In fact, we attacked the Chavurah people for not being involved enough by calling them Chavurah Bundes. But there was a huge amount of Chavurah, the population's involvement with Israel at the time. We created radical Zionism. It was a major part of who we were. And these guys, because they can't agree on Israel, they all know how to study there, and they have days, and this, the other thing, but they can't open their mouths about what Israel's doing left or right, because it'll split our community. And so Shai held this in the next 6 weeks is giving a very important series of lectures for the first time, so you're confronting Israel, thank God. So I think the Israel relationship is a little bit more complex. And as far as I remember, the Chavurah movement, which I was kind of a nook flipper, we were deeply involved with Israel, and this generation, Dafka, is sitting on the sidelines, and it's like Israel's it's there, but they don't do about it. So I think
anybody can go and take out their now dusty copy of the first Jewish catalog.
You're right.
And
Second,
Israel had on the first
look in
Jewish
the
capital.
second and third,
And it happened,
and
it changed.
Richie and Michael and Sharon were roundly criticized for that omission. But so look at Response magazine in the period, which I happen to edit, and I assure you, Israel was very prominent. We had Raskei leading Brera. We had Mintz writing a demurral on Brera, attacking Raskei and Brera for being in existence. And I was hosting Brera and publishing Mintz's article. So it was, Israel was really part and parcel of who we were at the time.
Let me bring us up to date for most of the people who weren't alive then.
They're here to learn.
The glossary of myths, bringing Steve, the study you did on approaching Jewish communities shows.
Which one? The one with Elie or the?
That was the 19th century study.
I'll tell you what it found, and you tell me what it found. It showed that these communities attract more women, more younger Jews. They're more serious about prayer, more content, right? Are these our best and brightest? And if so, how does that bode for the future of synagogue life? I guess I'd ask you, if you were the president of the synagogue today and you saw the research that you came up with, how would that impact on what you would do practically?
Oh, I think we have a lot to learn from the minyan. And I would say read empowered Judaism, and basically just do more work in facilitating people's efforts to create Jewish community, rather than demanding that they fit pre-existing models. So I've spoken at numerous synagogues where I've said, I'm sure that one day there'll be 15 young people who come to you and will want to daven in a kiddush room someplace, and you'll say, no, why did daven with us? Because we have a service and so on. And as this actually happened, I was talking, and the room starts tittering, because they said it wasn't 15 people, it was 50 people, and we're right now in the middle of the debate. So the basic message to synagogues is to facilitate the creation of intensive communities of people who will want to undertake their own Jewish life, number one. And number two, having just been through what I hope will be the last recession for a long time, the minyanim did very well in the recession. That was a serious problem. In that study, we learned that it costs about $200 a member to run a minyan, about $2,000 a member to run a shul. So we have the ability to do Jewish coming to life on the cheap financially by using the expertise that we have, as Jonathan points out, we have developed over the last 20 or 30 years. There was an explosion in day schools, improvements in camps, improvement in Hillel, expansion of the number of kids going to Israel, huge expansion of Jewish studies, and after a while you grow a number of things. And the last point is, and then they start getting married later, and they don't move to places where married people live. So you have high cultural capital and a demographic disjunction with the prevailing synagogues. So they go off and they create their own communities. I think that's a great thing.
You're not going to get reelected as president of your synagogue.
Actually, no. Elie never says this. I'm going to take this with you.
I'm the only one you haven't picked on yet.
Your image of the establishment, which I'm sure in Washington is true, but around the rest of the country, I think there's a lot more understanding and sympathy. I think you believe this too. A lot more understanding and sympathy and enthusiasm for what Elie and you are, what you're doing. I think that the initial reaction about 5 to 7 years ago was, indeed, you're competing with us and taking away our best people. Why should you come join us? And today, when I get up in class, I say, let's talk about your children and what your children want and what your children want to do. And I physically mean their children. The game, they understand that these children are not going to become necessarily vice president of Bethel. that they want to do something else. So there's a lot more sympathy and a lot more understanding of this. And it's just a hope that young people get involved in Jewish life wherever it may be and on their own terms. There's a lot more of that. The music has shifted over the last 5 to 7 years. Rabbis are still resisting innovation because they think that these newcomers are going to steal away their members. That still exists.
Let's recognize something that has got almost no press and that is very serious. And that is that all across the United States, rabbis in their 50s are being forced out of congregations. We have a generation of middle-aged rabbis who assume that they would go until retirement, who are pushed out, have no possibility of finding new positions, are not only deeply embittered, but are suggesting to young people that this is not a career that you can depend on. It's not something even that the Jewish Week, I think, is wanted much to talk about. I hear from these people, anybody in the active, anybody who knows people in the rabbinate knows it, and I think that we will pay a price for the tragedy, it is a human tragedy, that has gone on in the Great Recession in terms of what it has done to a certain generation of Jewish professionals. Obviously, the conservative movement has been the hardest hit, but don't underestimate its impact on the reform movement and on other movements. And, I don't know what it will do to young people thinking about Jewish professional life. So when they're bitter, they have a right to be bitter. They put in all these years studying. They assumed they were going to go on like the previous generation to 70, and at 58, they found themselves without jobs and without many possibilities. That's a story that we haven't wanted to talk about, but we will pay a price for that story.
I also wanted to point out something about rabbis, and that is, it is a concern when you think about independent minyanim. What is the role of the rabbi, particularly since so many are day school graduates who feel themselves somewhat competent in Jewish life and can be self-directing in Jewish life and value their own autonomy. And I think in many ways the rabbi really gets short-shrifted. The role of the rabbi in terms of pastoral care, the role of the rabbi as shepherd for the flock, the role of the rabbi as halachic decisor, as someone who has a great deal of wisdom and is the central figure in terms of a community teaching. And I am concerned about that. And I don't say that only as an Orthodox person. I say that in terms of watching what's happening in the world out there, in the sense we don't need this. In fact, one of the reasons that it's cheap to run a minyan is, you take a room and, as long as you have enough money for schnapps, you're good, right? So what does that mean, though, in terms of a rabbi's salary? And as you graduate and as the independent minyanim, as members are married and have children, and then their children will not have a relationship with the rabbi. It's very important for me as a parent that my children have a relationship with their rabbi, and that they feel that that's someone who will be shepherding them through the milestones of their lives. So I'm concerned about that, and I don't know if Elie, you want to speak to that. Is that something that you see in?
As a rabbi, one of the worst PR moves that could possibly be done for myself. Anyways, no,
He's not 50.
That's right. I think that what you're pointing to actually is an implicit critique that people somewhat voted with their feet on those traditional roles of the rabbi, which is to say that I'm not sure that most rabbinical schools are training rabbis or fundamentally attracting people who could play the roles of super pastor, shepherd of the flock, and halachic decisor. That is to say, in some ways, people said, not necessarily I reject the role of rabbi in an ideal form, but I reject the role of rabbi in the forms that I have encountered there. And if what a rabbi is seen as do we say, all things being equal, I'm going to join a synagogue, and their kids will have a relationship with a rabbi. My question is, are people willing to stand up and say the rabbinical training and the rabbinical candidates that we're attracting are not exactly what we need? We need something that's more suited for the roles that people are demanding implicitly.
There's a larger cultural issue here that we're about to, I want to explain. And here I in part blame my generation and what beyond. And that's the decline of a notion of authority and of excellence and of demand and of normative and all that. We used to argue about what are the correct norms. Radical Zionism, whatever they be. And in this generation, for the first time I've seen, there's a retreat from a notion that there are things that Jews should do, and I want to make sure that you do that because I care about you, but I also want Jews to do, and that includes you Orthodox. You Orthodox now say, I lead a halachic lifestyle. And I choose to do what I want. I was always used to your parents telling me, as Stephen, you're the type of Jew who should walk the shul. It bothers me that you're Mahal Shabbos. This was the interaction that Leon and I when we were at Columbia College, and I remember when I was at Columbia College. And this was the world in which we lived, and then we would fight, we'd go back and forth, whatever. But the entire culture, and this is again, it's not just Jews, it's Christianity as well. The entire culture has moved towards a celebration of diversity, inclusiveness, meaning making. We have to make meaning to people so they become engaged and involved. We're worried about losing people, so we have to attract them. And I really think that it's one of these Zen things. If you go after making meaning for people, you wind up not making meaning for people. So somehow we have to work back in the notion of authority, which then creates a place for rabbis. Because if we don't have authority, who the hell needs rabbis anyway? They're just like a little smarter than us. They know a few more things. All right, fine. Well, I have a question. But I think that there has to that we as Jews have made a mistake in retreating from the contestation over authority in many realms.
So that leads me to a question for you, Erica. About you write a lot about leadership in your work, with an emphasis on the importance of inspiration as part of leadership training. And you quote Daniel Goleman on the key aspects of his leadership, and he writes, "Great leaders move us. They ignite our passion and inspire the best in us. When we try to explain why they're so effective, we speak of strategy, vision, or powerful ideas, but the reality is much more primal. Great leadership works through the emotions." So can you talk a little bit about the emotional element of leadership and maybe some positive examples, and also how we protect our communities and especially young people from charismatic leaders who might not have the most positive needs that are driving them?
Yeah, Jim Collins wrote Good to Great talks about the liability of charisma, where charisma, we're drawn to those kind of personalities, but they end up often not having, the sound and fury signifying nothing. The substance piece isn't there. Are you asking me this in relation to young people or just a general question?
I guess specifically about younger people who sort of need to be protected that way. But I mean, you're talking
I used
about...
to be a young person. Now I talk about young people.
You're talking about inspirational leadership as a quality of leadership, that often stays under the radar. So
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are, and again, getting back to institutions, we're very board focused in the way that we lead. In other words, we have board meetings. But we have board meetings, and then, one of the things I do in teaching leadership when I talk about board development is I always ask people, is your role on a board meaningful? And they actually would never put board and meaningful together. And that's actually, in other words, it gets you to the Jonathan Boucher kind of the notion of commitment being outside of a sanctuary but in a boardroom, And we're seeing some years later that really never panned out. That there are people, that's not working for people. I mean, I work with a lot of people in my federation life where I would say that they see their office as their sanctuary. This is my commitment to Jewish life, comes through this. But it's not inherently meaningful per se. In other words, it's not filled with transcendent moments. Sometimes it has some aspects of community, but by and large, there's not the power of meaning. And so I think in that sense it's really deficient. And I think, again, getting back to that question of the J in Jewish and why be Jewish, people are afraid to answer that question. People who've been working for the Jewish community for decades can't answer that question. I think that says something to what we're trying to, or what we've been avoiding in leadership. How did I get involved in leadership? As Rabbi Frandel can tell you, I wrote my doctorate on Esther, and a commentary on Esther in the 16th century. It wasn't exactly a leadership document, but when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I was teaching for the Federation, and I became a kind of a salaried employee part-time. And I noticed everywhere I turned, there's leadership. There's young leadership, or women's leadership, and you get a pin, and you get, you go on a trip, and it's a senior leadership moment. And I started to realize this was all donor related. It wasn't leader, it was donor. It's just so much less sexy to say donor.
When the first followers mission to Israel.
Yeah, first followers.
We don't have any followers in Jewish life.
So I actually say it a little bit different. If you look at someone like John Cotter, who does a lot of leadership writing, he has an article about what leaders do, the difference between leaders and managers. And if you look, managers are much more operationally based. They make sure that things are happening as they need to happen, as opposed to leaders who are more strategic, more visionary. Someone gave me this example, and I think it's effective. They said the difference between, for example, an educational leadership, a principal and a headmaster. The principal has to make sure the doors are open every day. The headmaster has to make sure the doors are open 5 years from now, right? So that's a difference. I would say that we have created a generation of Jewish managers. Their idea is we increase a campaign incrementally. Well, that's not exciting to anybody, right? That's not a big Jewish idea. If we're not ambitious enough, we're not thoughtful enough, we're not risk-taking in certain appropriate ways. And what we've created is a group of managers, not only managers, money managers, because our boards are very lopsided. Now we go after people who have money, and almost exclusively. So you look at a typical board of a federation or a synagogue, and you're not going to see a real diversity of opinion. In fact, I remember speaking to a physician, and I said to him, there was a Jewish conference. I said, well, why don't you go? And he said, they're only real estate developers and hedge fund managers. Why would I go? And so that I was very struck by that, because that was a perception of someone who's very active in Jewish life, who really wouldn't toss his hat into a Jewish institutional life. So I think we have to really examine this notion of what a board is and what a meaningful board experience is, and introduce more conflict, and introduce more interest, and introduce more voting on issues. I think that's part of, it's not going to solve the problem, but it gets part way to creating a more inspired sense of what an institution can be.
Let me,
I just want to give a quick warning. I'm going to, you've been very patient. I want to open up some time for questions for you, so be thinking about some questions.
So let me articulate my heresy. Throughout the Jewish world, the question of why be Jewish is central. I've been to conferences on it. Honestly, I think it's the wrong question, and I think it has led us into all sorts of unfortunate debates on maybe you are Jewish, maybe you aren't Jewish, maybe Israel thinks you aren't Jewish and you think you are. No, you are Jewish, but what are you going to make of being Jewish? We never asked the why be Jewish. The assumption was you are Jewish, you can do something with it. Yeah, I could change my name from Sarna to Shlemiel, and then I would be a Sarna. But at the end of the day, I am a Sarna. It is, what am I going to do in that way? And I think if we view Judaism as something that is really deeply part of your identity, and then you ask, what are you going to do with it? That would lead us in a much more productive direction than this question of why be Jewish, which we've been asking now for a couple of decades. I don't think is all that productive, and I'm not sure that even in the past that was the most productive way for Jews to think. So I throw that out, although I don't expect the Jewish community to buy it, but what? I would love to see young people really create a mission. What does it mean to have a great diaspora Jewish community? That, to my mind, is the kind of question we ought to be asking. And I don't think Why Be Jewish has led us in very productive directions.
Anybody want to respond to that before we...
I agree for different reasons.
You want to tell us?
I don't know what it's thinking of, but I've long felt the same that I feel that but it's for different reasons. The reason is that I think we put too much, and this is the sociologist talking, but we put too much emphasis on the intellectual justification of Jewish motivation as a way of motivating Jews, when in fact Jews find the motivation for being Jewish in the company of other Jews. And therefore we need to create, especially now, given the declining relationships between Jews and Jews on all levels, marriage, friendship, neighborhood, business, politics, and so forth. Since Jewish meaning is found in the experience of doing Jewish with other Jews, and since fewer Jews are with other Jews, fewer Jews are doing Jewish, and fewer Jews are finding Jewish meaning. So the meaning is derivative from the social tissue that exists and that is frayed and that needs to be repaired in and of itself. And we have few policies that attend to the fraying Jewish social tissue per se, for lots of good reasons. But if I were to, as I'm recommending another weapon in the arsenal of Jewish Commonwealth policy, it would be attend to the social tissue through various acts of Jewish social engineering. And that's enough. I don't think about that.
Was anyone listening to the NPR right before this? Anyone was listening to NPR? We need a JPR because that would really go far. But Ira Glass was on From This American Life, and he talked about an interview he did with someone who's actually currently a journalist, a radio broadcaster for NPR in economics. And he said when he was 16 years old, he used to read biographies and autobiographies of Jewish prime ministers, Israeli prime ministers. And he read this biography. He was reading about David Ben-Gurion, who started at a very young age to write journals, and he had really a sense of his own greatness. And he was almost preparing for the moment when someone would read these journals of his own greatness. So this journalist decides at the age of 16, who apparently didn't have many friends, he decides that if he's going to be great, he should start keeping a journal now, right? So at 16, he begins to write journals as if he would one day become the prime minister. And he writes, Jews and managing the whole state of Israel, I have a very big job ahead of me, all in capital letters, right? So it was so interesting that he saw this path to greatness because one day he would be a prime minister also.
Is this
and
talking?
What?
Is this TV talking?
No. This is someone who was an, he didn't end up. So our class says to him, did you, at 30, when you first came on my show, did you look back at those journals and what did you think if you did look back? And he said, of course I look back. And he says, and I'm so embarrassed and I feel so ashamed because what I do now is so small. Mm-hmm. And I actually thought it was so incredible to read this sense of what's the big dream out there? I guess it gets to what Jonathan's saying. And Ira Glass was so taken by this because he said, here you are, a famous journalist. And he was saying, no, it's not enough. And there was this big Jewish dream that I had and this manifesto, and I kind of compromised on that in some way.
What about your journalism story? Diary at very young age for the same reason, I think.
Okay. We just for format there, and given that this is a Jewish audience, I just have to make this preamble statement here. We're going to ask that the questions are actually in the form of a question.
You could do that, make a statement, and say, wouldn't you agree?
panelists for your insights. As someone who attends in one of these independent minyanim, I really don't even recognize what you guys were talking about on the panel tonight. I think, with all due respect, I think you're amazing, Dr. Brown, but
we're off to a good start.
I just find this analogy of someone planned a party for us and we don't want to come as like totally off the mark. I mean, I didn't hear any discussion tonight about the content of these independent minyanim. I think that's actually one of the primary, if not the primary driver of millennial or whatever.
I wasn't talking about independent minyanim in that remark, and I want to make that clear. I'm talking about in the federated community, right, in the federation world, who sits on the board, who plans programs. I wasn't talking about independent minyanim.
Well, but that sentiment has been echoed throughout on the panel, that it's more about we want to feel included, we want to feel like more of a structural question, but nobody, at least I didn't hear anyone address the actual substantive reasons and halachic reasons and social reasons why people are going to these independent minyanim.
I thought I'd address some social reasons, and that the increase in Jewish cultural capital and the demographic disconnect between where the people are and what the synagogues are, geographically where they are. You put all that together, and then you also have cultural shifts which move towards autonomy and the ability of the individual to control his or her own spirituality, and the impact of the Christian culture which accepts and moves towards home churching and smaller Christian communities. You put all that together, and you have a fancy explanation of what it's about.
Read Elie's book.
No, but we've read Elie's book. To clarify, I think what Steve was saying, if I may, we're asking why values haven't been talked about tonight. The word meaning has been thrown around a number of times, as the word community. And I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not going to dispute the importance of meaning in the attraction of all of these Jews from perhaps the conservative and reformed communities, which I did not grow up in, to these minyanim. But we're sitting here in an Orthodox shul celebrating its centennial. And it's been acknowledged that these minyanim and these communities could not have had the robustness of knowledge, of performance, without some involvement, if not a lot of involvement, from day school graduates, and many of whom from the Orthodox community. And if we are not, can we hear about, we haven't heard the word halacha or egalitarianism up here.
I said halacha and
we haven't heard it cited as a reason, like we've heard meaning and personal preference. Even the tagline of this tonight's talk was like, will personal preference win over community? Has anyone considered that these are actually perhaps people are seeking halacha and community, actually in violation of their personal preference, which might be to stay in their own community, because that's what's comfortable, but they are leaving these communities actually out of values, not out of personal preference. At least in the Orthodox communities, to be frank, this is not abstract. This is Kesher Israel. There's an independent minyan here, DC Minyan. There's another recent one started, Rosh Pinah. The reasons people may leave an Orthodox institution to go to one of these minyanim is very unlikely to be meaning or community, or that they didn't like the singing at Kesher Israel, or that they didn't find. There's other reasons, and I guess maybe the talk wasn't supposed to be about Orthodox institutions, but I would love to hear what your thoughts are on Orthodox institutions. Well,
answer a question with a question, no Jewish tradition.
I would say kavod avriyot would be one major reason why a lot of women leave that community, but there are many others for, I'm sure, a lot of people. But I want to hear from you, because you're the sociologist.
I think that what you're pointing to is actually what I think is fascinating about the minyanim for me, which is to say it wasn't a group of people who were at one place and left wholesale to go to another place. First of all, they weren't at any place. But I think that oftentimes they get painted as, and this is sort of the reverse engineering of describing what happens in minyanim, they get painted as a subset of conservative Judaism because they map onto some of the stated visions of what some version of conservative Judaism policy person says that conservative Judaism is, which is essentially egalitarianism plus tradition, et cetera, et cetera. Once you get into egalitarianism, you're out of orthodoxy, right? So no Orthodox synagogue is claiming minyanim; they're actively disclaiming them, right? And some minyanim, about 30% of the minyanim have mechitzot, and they are actually trying to claim the word Orthodox, but Orthodox will have none of it. But I think what's interesting is, even in those, and this is about Shira Hadasha as well, it's also not a full-scale Orthodox secessionist movement. That is to say, it's a combination of all of the above, which made it very interesting for me. In other words, when I was in college, there was the A, B, and C minyan that mapped onto A, B, and C denomination. In the minyan world, it's not that simple, and you have a sort of melting pot of these people. It's not equal distribution, but I think it's, as you said, women from Orthodoxy and some men, and from and the more traditional wing of people who grew up outside of Orthodoxy, and they're finding each other for different reasons. So you'll have people. So what ends up happening is, and this also gets into the chavurah, it's like, what ends up happening is you'll have a full kriya. You don't have triennial in any of the minyanim, because they're drawing from enough people from Orthodoxy who never stand for a triennial minyan. What are you talking about triennial, right? And on the other hand, they're having some engagement with singing and whatever meaning thing that frankly Orthodoxy could take it or leave it in some ways. But people are driving for that. Again, painting broad brushes. But I think, look, I'll just end personally for me. Another word hasn't been mentioned is God. I think it's like, for me, the reason that I did all this was not start an institution, not to reject an old institution. It was like, I had a relationship with God that was on life support. I found a group of people who saw a path to resuscitating that relationship. It was through community of people who had a particular approach to prayer, halakha, and community. And thank God, because I was sort of on the skids on that front. I think for a lot of people, it's a critical life. It's not meaning, it's religion, and that's why people find it very powerful.
It's not values. That's the other thing. I think we overplay the influence of values. That it's aesthetics and personal relationships. I know I can speak from Mary. A couple weeks ago we davened in the Mission Minyan. Last year we had I'll speak for myself now. I think she agrees. We had one of the greatest davening experiences was in your shul. Cohen around sleepless time. And so the question is, we have such great experiences in davening in the minyan, and why don't we daven all the time? Well, because we're 60. No, it's true. I want to daven people my age. So we don't daven. So Mary's starting a minyan in our home. We'll meet let's hope it works out. So there's a personal story.
Nobody under 60 admitted.
No, but we're yeah, I know. You wanted to talk. You wanted to pose yourself as young. This is your chance. So don't overplay values. Don't underplay them either. But understand that now what I'm trying to say. Aesthetics and social relationships are highly critical in helping people decide where they want to live out their davening life.
And you think that's true even from people who are going from the Orthodox community?
Well, I was going to say,
let's find out.
I think, and had the title being Wither Orthodoxy, double meaning, I think that would be, I happen to think it's an exceedingly important moment in Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy over the last 50 years has become an enormous Big Ten. It used to be the conservative movement was the Big Ten, from Saul Lieberman to Mordechai Kaplan. Today, Orthodoxy is the Big Tent made from YCT to Satmar. We know the beauty of Big Tents.
Never uttered in the same breath.
We know the beauty of Big Tents, and we know the great danger of Big Tents. The great danger is they collapse. And I think that the phenomenon you are seeing may indeed lead. I'm the person who believes there will be a split in Orthodoxy at a moment when I can walk into a shul and at a glance, by looking at its siddur, know whether it's on one side or another. This is a story I've heard before, and it led first, when it was the Union prayer book, I knew what was Reform, and when it was the Silverman prayer book, I knew when it was conservative. And it seems to me that when I go into a shul, I know Sachs or Art Scroll, I know if it's going to have a women's tefillah group or it's going to oppose a women's tefillah group. I have some notion of how it stands on a variety of other issues. This is a bad sign for a movement in many ways. And I think that this, it's a different, if you want to invite us back to talk on Orthodoxy, this is a very critical moment where the future of Orthodoxy will be decided, and the possibility of a split in Orthodoxy is, of course, very real. You now have multiple organizations that don't recognize one another, a whole group of rabbis who are not admitted. This is very serious. I don't, of course, want to intrude on the area of the rock, but sociologically speaking, of course, you're pointing to a very significant phenomenon, and young people, as they always do, are going to play a very important role in determining whether that big tent will indeed stretch further or whether it will collapse. And at this, my readers, it could go either way, but I'm pessimistic.
Yeah.
It's no surprise that I think that a lot of this earlier conversation has very heavy economics underpinnings. Just very, very briefly, you commented on, you said for the minyan it's $200 and for the shul it's $2,000. Well, that's because there's a lot of freeloaders, and I mean that in an economic term, which is that a lot of these minyanim are meeting in Jewish institutions like a JCC or a synagogue that wouldn't have been there if people 50 years ago didn't put forth millions of dollars. And those kids today aren't having to pay that. But it's very nice that when you're ready to go to a synagogue to have a bar mitzvah, then you'll join, and then you'll take advantage of the institution. So there's a big, heavy emphasis on the economics, and I think what happened was not only are we managers, but we became an economic organization. You've been focusing specifically tonight on religious and education institutions, and I'd like to get you to switch to talk a little bit about socioeconomic institutions. Steve, you talked about social justice. This is not a demographic shift. What I'm asking about is the shift amongst the Jewish community in social justice. Is it social justice towards Jewish causes? Is it Jewish people doing social justice? I mean, the fact that Jews are no longer involved in unions, those are institutions. They were Jewish institutions. The fact that Jews are not the ones at the forefront now of doing the protest. Could you talk a little bit about what's happening to the socioeconomic institutions within Judaism?
Steve, you want to start us off?
I don't think our time, because I don't have a good fix on your question. But maybe Jonathan does.
So, look, you of course are pointing to a very important development, whereas an earlier generation had moved away from social justice, which indeed so central in the 50s, and had argued we needed to turn inward, focus on Israel, focus on Soviet Jewry. Not surprisingly, after a very good run of about 40 years, there was a sense we need to turn out again. You know, this is so Hillel knew also we need a balance. We can't only be for ourselves, but if we're not for ourselves, who are we? So we've turned. The great, on the one hand, it's a wonderful thing to see young people excited about improving the world. This is certainly as much part of our values as improving our own Jewish society. On the other hand, and I think you're pointing to this, you don't have to be Jewish to transform the third world. I think that the new causes are not intrinsically Jewish the way Soviet Jewry and Zionism were. Thank God that American Jewish World Service has very significant people like Elie's wife who are using Jewish values and transforming it educationally so that it is deeply Jewish. But is there a danger that people will say, I don't need to be Jewish to do this? Of course. So I'll get in a second mention of Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis had a daughter brought up with a very strong sense of social justice. She meets the son of the man who wrote the book on the social gospel. His name was Rauschenbusch. American religion reads Rauschenbusch's book. Well, Brandeis and Rauschenbusch found they had an enormous amount in common. They got married, but the subsequent generation of Rauschenbusches know nothing about Judaism, are not Jewish, and can't understand it. There is that danger as we move back. But does that mean we're not going to engage the great issues of our day? We're not going to be concerned about the third world? Obviously not. But we need to do it knowing some of the dangers inherent in it. At the same time, we desperately need a new Jewish mission to excite 21st century Jews, because saving Israel and remembering the Holocaust and fighting anti-Semitism, the big three of our parents' era, does not excite my students and probably does not excite many people in this audience the way it once did. We need a new Jewish mission. While I'm thrilled at the growth of social justice, in part it's a symptom of the absence of a great Jewish mission to inspire this generation of Jews.
Just one line. I was in Jerusalem and I met a young woman from Argentina, and she says, "There's so many Jewish organizations and so few Jewish causes today." And it struck me so profoundly, growing up in the Soviet Jewry movement. And I could say that I wouldn't be doing my job today had it not been for that movement and the excitement of that movement and the majestic feeling of taking down the Anatoly Sharansky poster, for my wall, and the bracelet, and that knows that was a real turning point for me in terms of becoming a Jewish communal professional and educator. So I would say that I think that's reflective of a lot of fandoms. You're getting it in Nicaragua, you're getting it in South Africa, but you're not getting it associated with Jewish causes.
But in no large group of persecuted Jews anywhere in the world, there is no moment in modern Jewish history when we could make that statement, but we can today. And that's a wonderful thing, but it has deprived us of the mission that was once central. We need a different mission, and maybe it is to create a great diaspora Jewish community.
Let me just jump in on the freeloader comment just because of that. Stick that in there.
Because they were talking about you.
I think that, I want to say two things. One, I totally share your concern on the one hand, which is to say that I run a nonprofit now that is totally driven by fundraising.
Right.
Nobody pays for education. In fact, that's why governments tax people for education. And that's why Israel has a robust learning culture and America doesn't. But we have an incredible constituency of people who have benefited from Jewish education, Israel, and the Minyanim. And because they're used to thinking that writing a $36 check is enough, is a significant donation to fund a minyan, which it is, they are not anywhere near supporters of the institution that we're doing, which is essentially targeted at that age to educate them further in Jewish life. And we run into the problem of that Erica described of, we have a board of 7 people that's financially mixed, and that's a recipe for suicide if you're trying to run an organization over $1 million. You're not going to get by on $36 donations. So I'm totally with you on that, and I also think it should be said, because it doesn't get said enough, that there's I feel a tremendous amount of gratitude to the existing institutions that educated me, to the institution of the State of Israel that inspired me, to the shul that I belong to, which is living through its 80th year. And at the same time, I think that the minyanim are actually not really the cause of the problem, or even B, the expression of the problem. The real problem is in the locus of the lead up to the minyanim, which is Hillel, birthright, and all the sort of paid trips. We're a party to this too. I'm not saying the minyanim here, but the yeshiva that I run, we grant people fellowships that they have to win in order to come for the summer. They're not paying. They're getting money. They're getting a stipend, right? And I think that we lost a culture of paying for things. It would be heresy to say that you have to join Hillel by shelling out dollars. And if you did, you better believe your parents would be paying it.
Our parents did.
Right, okay, so but your parents were trained to give money. But I have to say that this is not the minyan or even Michael Steinhardt's fault. Like, talk to the New York Times. It's, internet is free. People expect free. And I would say that the minyanim are actually a step ahead because they're getting people to write their first check. So it's $36, right? But it's their first check. And I would say that actually trains them to, $36 and they're not every minyan, but you know what I'm saying? And I think it actually trains them that, things aren't free. You actually have to pay some money. The trick is how to get someone to jump from $36 to $1,000. And I don't believe it's an issue of income. I think people have the income.
Look, we haven't, let's take questions. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tali. So as someone who graduated from the Jewish day school system and hopefully next year will be in the Jewish day school system, I wanted to ask you about...
back?
What?
She didn't abandon her homework.
So I wanted to ask you, we didn't really talk as much about the day school system except really to praise it, which I do think it deserves, but I also think that I'm not really sure that it's really meeting the needs of students today. I think that with charter schools and with other models, we're seeing that Jewish day school graduates outside of the New York, New Jersey area are not as well prepared for college and are also not really getting the Jewish education they need. So where do you think that's going? How are we going to improve our Jewish education system?
Okay, finally an easy question.
I mean, this is an area that Gary's written a great deal about and may want to weigh in on. I'm very leery of those who think, we should go back to the supplementary system. I'm a historian. Why did we create day schools? We created day schools because the supplementary system failed for the vast majority of Jews. Not all of them. I'm a graduate of the Boston Hebrew College, which was a supplementary high school program and then college. But but it failed for a great many. And day school succeeded. The very act of making Judaism supplementary was a statement about Judaism. It was the supplement. It was the thing you went to when you were tired. Thank God, day schools ended that. And although
it's a different kind of tired.
And it's very, day schools taught people how to use time efficiently. Day school students learn that time matters, and whenever I see them at university, they're different from the people who played all afternoon because high schools in their poor places, gave them 3 hours of playtime. In any case, it's a huge challenge. Clearly, and we see it especially in the New York community, is not able to pay for the kinds of day school education that we once hoped we could. But I would hate to see us give up on what was really one of the most successful investments the Jewish community ever did. It's very rare in Jewish life that a movement bets the house and wins. Orthodoxy bet the house on Jewish day schools. And boy, the fact that you're here 100 years later, most people would have said, not only wouldn't the shul exist, but there wouldn't be any young people here at this point. That's due to Jewish day schools. I don't think you want to quickly give up on a bet that paid out so well. You may want to tinker, but I know of very few successes in 20th century Jewish life that match the success of the Jewish day school movement. We all like to criticize it, but it beats all of the alternatives, and I believe, although I'm happy in all kinds of Jewish education, but I do not think charter schools that teach Hebrew are going to replace Jewish day schools. They may be better than some Sunday schools. Steve once proved that going to Sunday school was
in a sense, I'm offering, I would say, a contemporary version of what Jonathan just said. That's what's so new. It seems to me that all the evidence that we have, that day schools continue to perform on both those levels that you mentioned. You could have had an awful experience. I don't know why you go back to day school. You could. I don't know. But so I'm not invalidating your personal judgment. I'm just saying it's the first time anyone has ever said that to me, and I wouldn't want us to leave from here saying, oh, there was general. These people listened and they said they shook their heads yes. I'm saying no. As far as I know, no. But things could be changing, and I will now be more aware of it. But as at this moment, as a doctor, as a public health official, I'm telling you, I don't think we yet have an epidemic to worry about.
I think there's a lot more to Tally's observation coming through personal experience and speaking to my own kids who are in the same school. And I will say that I actually think that I'm not going to argue from the college preparedness and, how many kids get in. I'm sure that there's research on that we could, that I don't know. Talking about the Jewish experience in the Jewish day school and whether or not it matches in sophistication, in nuance, in excitement, if you're a high school student, what's going on in an AP European history class. I honestly don't think the educators are prepared enough. I simply don't think that most of the Jewish educators we have, there's numerous reasons for this. You could cite the fact that we pay so little, so we don't have the highest caliber people going into the profession. Current company excluded. But the fact is that a lot of people who have taught my children in the past in other schools and currently, I don't think bring to the table sometimes the educational sophistication or experimentation that we have that's going on in general studies. And I think shame on us that we haven't demanded more. And shame on us that we didn't pay attention to what our students really needed. And shame on us that we didn't open up the day school environment as a place where you could safely ask a question, a theological question, about what you really, where is God in your life, and why are you forcing me to pray, and it's not meaningful for me. It's not a safe space to ask some of those questions. And people walk out of Jewish life because by the time they get to college, they're having a much more sophisticated experience, and Judaism isn't catching up. So that's our responsibility. And if we're going to take that responsibility seriously, we're not going to answer it through the charter school. I believe that the charter school, that is a fiction to try to answer the affordability question, but it's not answering the meaning question. And that gets to answer where Rebecca is, because why are so many Orthodox graduates going to, who don't really want to like an independent minyan? That's not where they want to be in their home, is because we haven't given them the right home. And that's shame on us. So we have to do a little better job of that. So I need to not answer your question before, but to put it within a larger framework of saying this isn't about a shul alone. This is about an entire package. I think Orthodoxy has an amazing lifestyle package for people, and especially when you're raising children today. But the other side of it is when you look closely under the telescope, we're not providing a safe space to ask the critical questions, and we're not developing critical reasoning and analysis. And there's only a limit of what you get on a Talmudic page. So I think we need to do a better job. And thank you for asking. And I hope you're going back to change this.
If I could just pick up on what Erica said, two very quick points of concern that I've observed particularly about Jewish day school, high schools. One was a study that was done by the Melton Center at Hebrew University that just was reported at the North American Jewish Day School Conference a couple of weeks ago, where they interviewed day school students who are studying about modern Israel, and some of them kind of parroting the common language about support for Israel, but then admitting to the interviewer in the videos that this is what they're told in class, and it seems like their connection to it is very minimal. That what they're finding is that when students go to Israel, even at very young ages, 7th grade, 8th grade, that's where the real connection is, not so much in the classroom. And the real pity is very, very few of even our finest day schools even teach modern Israel. Begin is of Sharansky. And
they actually learn about the Maccabees.
And the other issue, which Erica mentioned, I think, and that's from more informal discussion with teachers and educators in Jewish high schools, in Orthodox schools, is the real lack of spirituality, and about issues about making kids daven and who don't want to daven, and what do you do about that. I think that's starting to emerge more publicly as an issue that has to be dealt with. I haven't looked over here, so yes.
I think this is related in terms of keeping people involved in the Orthodox institutions or even in existing older institutions after they graduate home. Like, I grew up in very young institutions. My synagogue and camp and high school were all founded in my lifetime. And so it's not new to me to make new institutions. Like, that's what my parents did and that's what I did. And so now I come and I graduate Hillel, and it's not just me, it seems to be all my friends. You graduate Hillel and you come into an institution with 100 years of history. And what do institutions like that do to say, like, we recognize the fact that everything you've done up until this point has been very formative in young institutions that are still building their identity. How do you bring those two things together?
So again, I think of two issues, one Jewish and one not Jewish. In the not Jewish world, there are just numerous books that reflect the widespread concern of how do we create a space for our younger adults who want to come back to church and be part of this. And there are books about melding through different generations, churches within churches, special ministries to young people. This is an ongoing issue, and the more recent research shows that contrary to what we were told, or maybe it may have been true in the 90s, but 10 years later, young people's engagement with Christianity has declined, in large part because of delayed marriage and childbearing of other reasons as well. So that's on that side. On the Jewish side, if you lay out the age spectrum from birth until death, and look at where are the Jewish institutions that are extant, and how much money is being invested in those institutions, you find that there's a gap from right after Hillel to before people give birth to a 7-year-old Jewish child. So in that 20-year period, there's just fewer institutions and less money going to those institutions for a variety of structural reasons, but in part because the people who pay, this gets back to the $36 example, may it be 1,000 very soon, but here for your menu. The people who pay for institutions are parents of 7-year-old and older children who make institutions for their children and make institutions for themselves, which are often built around their children. And there's this gap in that period. And so what you're talking about, which is like reflecting kind of the institutional stumbling over how do we connect here, how do we provide space for, how do you enter into this? I'm just saying that it's part of a much larger picture that you can look at. And now the response, there are two logical responses. One is, as you've done throughout your life, this is done for you. Make your own institutions or within institutions. And second, teach the existing institutions to make space for you, so that when you go to a board meeting, and you all go to the same board meeting, and you look at the board, it's all people who are 52 to 62 years old, who are parents, grandparents. You look like they're all built out of the same demographic cookie cutter. We have to create institutions where that doesn't happen. And that is, twas ever thus. That's an ongoing struggle. There's one more issue that's coming up. And that is, we're going to live longer. We're going to live longer. We are living longer.
And be better looking.
Big face up. We're going to live longer. So we're now entering the first time in Jewish history that I know about, where there are going to be 4 adult Jewish generations coexisting. 20s and 30s, 40s and 50s, 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s. We're going to have 4 Jewish adult generations, and we're not going to just step aside. My generation, we're not going to kind of what we're saying. Here, take it over. So it's okay. No, we have a Jewish life to lead as well. And so the next phase, and I'm looking at Marion, who's been thinking about this and working on this, as of other people. The next phase of Jewish institution building is going to be Jewish institutions for people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they're going to be asking, well, it's okay that you kids want to do what you want to do. How about us? And how do we do this together? That's going to be. So we're going to come back. There's Hitler and Sons of Young here, and we'll talk about what we built over the last 20 years to make it a meaningful Jewish life, to use this current expression, for people who were born around 1950, give or take a few years.
Just worth pointing out, this congregation is now part of a rather small number of synagogues when you look at the totality of American synagogues that have reached a century. It's worth asking the question, how did it reach a century? What can we learn? Honestly, this crowd is younger than the crowd that I remember when I was here working on my doctorate in the 1970s. It's worth asking how that happened, and successful synagogues look at Shearith Israel, our oldest synagogue, which is very different than the place that existed in the 18th century, and that's why it's still around. There are many other synagogues that are not here. But it's worth, you're asking, why is it that Israel is still here? What has it done right? We've talked a lot about things that have gone wrong, but you did something right, because I assure you that the folks, at the Capitol didn't send money to keep this going, and it's worth asking that question of the synagogues that have made it to 100 years. There aren't so many of them.
And I just wanted to, I was thinking of the pasuk Al Tashtefeni Be'et Zikna. And we never apply that to institutions, right? The idea of not throwing out an institution because it's too old, right? And basically being able to say, along the lines of what Jonathan's talking about, what are the wisdom? I'm seeing curiosity from the baby boomer generation to look at the kind of birthright generation and say, what makes them tick? What it was that initial skepticism has given way to a lot of curiosity. And I'm not seeing that process in the reverse so much, and that concerns me also, because honestly, I'll tell you what we haven't discussed here. What I see happening in synagogue life is you've got a minyan for Tat Shabbat, and you've got singles week, and you've got and we're segmenting. We've got women's tefillah, and we're segmenting out all these different ages and subcultures of concerns. A community is it has to be a place where multiple voices and multiple ages and different genders interact in a healthy and robust way. I want to just tell you a fascinating thing. Again, another NPR interview with the clergy.
You're a learn also?
Yeah, with the clergy. I spent a lot of time in my car. With the clergy who were advisors on the Prince of Egypt film. It came time to do the voice of God, and they couldn't figure out what should the voice of God sound like. Leon was an option, but they moved away. So they wanted. Initially, there was a kind of James Earl Jones sort of, the traditional voice of God. And there were people who said it's not egalitarian. There were female clergy who argued about it. But what about young people? What about that? Why should God's voice be an old voice? So what they did is they synthesized voices. Young people and old people and women and men and black voice and Latino voice. I mean, it was just the theological concept of it was such a remarkable thing that the voice of God had to be in some way a reflection of the voice of all humanity. And I actually am concerned about that as we move to subculture and in synagogue life and fragmentation, that we've lost what it means to really be a community that redeems each other, because it's not about age, and it's not about sex, and it's not about money, and it's got to be about everyone having a voice within an institution, and I'm worried about that.
I looked at my watch, and it's time to wind down, so I'm going to just ask our panelists to give us a very brief...
Take the questions, and then just talk too much and listen too little. There are plenty of important questions out there, and
that Jonathan will be here to answer.
And honestly, I think one of the reasons a lot of people have left us is because smart older Jews talk too much and didn't listen to them. And they said, we'll create our own institutions where our questions will be answered. And it does worry me, but I do think that even as we face new concerns about what is this young generation doing and so on, the good thing about being a Jewish historian is I know Jews have always asked that question, and in a sense, what I find comforting about looking at the whole span of Jewish history is that even though every generation has tried Gewalt, somehow or other, we're still here. And God willing, at 150th, since we're living longer, we'll come back and we'll be able to try Gewalt once again.
I'm going to leave the last word for Erica. So.
No, you're doing fine. We're doing Surah Pumdina in reverse. Continue. She's next.
Ellie's next, and then Erica.
I guess what I would like to leave you is with the next panel topic wouldn't be about through the institutional frame. I think the institutional frame is a red herring. I really want to know, as Jonathan said, why Kesher lasted 100 years and why the other synagogues didn't. And it's not because I'm interested in institutions getting to 100. I think that the frame of life that we look through is all about institutions and denominations because they're easy categorizing, media-friendly group of words. But I think that really the bottom line question is the one that Erica asked about how are you going to put the J into those acronyms. And I think that the fundamental shift that we are not yet willing to do is answering that through education. I think actually one quoted what you said about Orthodoxy. They bet the house on day school. They also bet the house on a year of yeshiva education as standard following day school because in some ways day school wasn't enough. And there are obviously critiques of that model, but you fundamentally ended up with a completely different Orthodoxy that is benefiting from that generation of people who went through yeshivas in Israel. Essentially, they bet the house on education and immersion education and not stopping at 12th grade education. And the question that I have is, are we willing, instead of to analyze what institutions are around or not, and say, what would it take to actually invest in significant education for a population that, except for Orthodoxy, hasn't bet the house on?
I want to thank the Academy, my professor, my director. Actually, I would say more on a personal note than talk about institutions. I work predominantly outside of the Orthodox community. I can say that for the past 23 years, I haven't ever felt a moment of discomfort identifying myself very proudly as an Orthodox Jew. I don't cower from that. I think that, I feel very privileged to have a remarkable education, to have studied with so many remarkable people, to count remarkable colleagues as friends, and to be able to, I think Orthodox people are hoarders. I think we have not been generous enough with the education that we have, with the life of meaning, with, I think we take community for granted because it's been so easy for us and so natural. And I think now, hopefully, we understand we can't take those things for granted. And in that respect, we're all educators. We all have to see that being an Orthodox person today means being a teacher in Klal Yisrael, teaching the values that have made us who we are, and going out into the world and seeding the world with those values. So don't keep it to yourself. That's the charge for the evening. Because forget about institutions. Every act of meaning comes in relationship. And if we, the opportunity to expand the sphere of influence is very powerful. And if all of us were able to do that this evening, it would have been, in future, it'll be a great success.